April 13th, 1986. Detroit's East Side. 1,000,000 square feet of American history collapses in 7 seconds. The Stroh Brewery, built brick by brick across 135 years, stretching along Gratiot Avenue like a cathedral to the working class, folds into a cloud of dust and silence. 3 months later, they detonate what remains. When the smoke clears, there is nothing. No copper kettles, no fire brewing flames shooting 15 feet into the air, no neon sign glowing red above the water tower, just flat earth where 1,159 people once earned a living. This was the house that Bernhard Stroh built in 1850 with $150 and a wheelbarrow full of beer. 5 generations carried that flame. Through Revolution, Prohibition, 2 world wars, and the riots that burned Detroit to its foundations. By 1988, the Stroh family sat on the Forbes 400 list, worth $700 million. By 2008, the family fund ran dry. Every last dollar gone. How does a dynasty survive everything history throws at it, then destroy itself? This is the story of fire. The fire that brewed America's beer, and the ambition that burned it all down. In 1849, revolution swept across the German states. Barricades burned in Berlin. Soldiers fired into crowds in Dresden. And in the small town of Kirn, nestled in the Rhineland-Palatinate, a 27-year-old brewer named Bernhard Stroh made a decision that would echo across 5 generations. He left. The Strohs had been brewing beer in a family-owned inn since the 1750s, nearly a century of tradition poured into wooden barrels for local farmers and tradesmen. But tradition does not pay when revolution empties the streets. Bernhard had learned every step of the craft from his father. He knew the grain. He knew the water. He knew the yeast. What he did not know was whether any of it would matter in America. He arrived in Detroit in 1850 with $150 in his pocket. That was all. No partners, no investors, no wealthy uncle waiting at the dock. Just a young man with a family recipe and the kind of stubbornness that either builds empires or buries dreamers. Detroit in 1850 was not the industrial colossus it would become. The automobile was still half a century away. But the city was growing fast, swollen with German immigrants who had fled the same upheaval that pushed Bernhard across the Atlantic. And those immigrants wanted one thing that tasted like home: beer. Bernhard set up a small brewing operation in a basement on Catherine Street. The equipment was primitive. The space was cramped. The beer was anything but ordinary. He brewed a Bohemian-style Pilsner, a lighter, crisper lager that had been perfected only 8 years earlier at the Municipal Brewery of Pilsen, Bohemia. In a city drowning in heavy German ales, Bernhard Stroh offered something different, something modern, something people would cross the street for. But he had no tavern, no saloon contract, no distribution network. So he did what a man with $150 does. He improvised. His sons loaded small kegs into a wheelbarrow and pushed them door to door through Detroit's unpaved streets. They knocked. They poured. They sold. 1 glass at a time, 1 doorstep at a time, the Stroh name spread through the neighborhoods of Detroit's East Side. By 1860, customers were asking Bernhard to bottle his beer so they could drink it at home. Demand was outpacing the basement. In 1865, he purchased additional land, expanded his operation, and made a decision that would define the company's identity for the next 134 years. He adopted the heraldic lion emblem from the Kierberg Castle, the most famous landmark in his hometown of Kirn, and renamed his operation the Lion's Head Brewery. It was a declaration. The immigrant with the wheelbarrow was building something permanent. Bernhard Stroh did not live to see how permanent. On June 24, 1882, he died at his home in Detroit. He was 60 years old. He left behind a thriving brewery, a loyal customer base, and a son ready to carry the flame. Bernhard Stroh Jr. took the helm immediately. His first act was to rename the company the B. Stroh Brewing Company, a tribute to his father's memory. His second act was to think bigger than his father ever had. The introduction of pasteurization and refrigerated rail cars had transformed the beer industry. A brewer was no longer chained to his city. Beer could travel. And Bernhard Jr. intended to make Stroh's travel far. Within years, Stroh's beer reached taverns in Florida and Massachusetts, states that would have seemed as distant as the moon to the man who once sold beer from a wheelbarrow. In 1893, the brewery earned something money cannot buy. At the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the same fair that introduced America to the Ferris wheel and Cracker Jack, Stroh's Bohemian beer won a blue ribbon. 43 years after a German immigrant brewed his first batch in a Detroit basement, the Stroh name stood among the finest in the nation. The lion from Kierberg Castle was no longer just a symbol. It was a promise. In 1902, the company shed its founder's initials and became simply the Stroh Brewery Company. By the turn of the century, it was the largest beer producer in Detroit, pumping out 300,000 barrels a year. In 1905, Stroh's purchased the Ruoff Brewery next door on Gratiot Avenue, swallowing a neighbor the way the company would later try to swallow giants. Then came the man who gave Stroh's its soul. In 1908, Bernhard Jr.'s brother Julius Stroh took over the brewery. Julius was not content to simply maintain what his family had built. Before assuming control, he traveled across Europe, visiting the great breweries of Germany, Austria, and Bohemia. He studied their methods, he tasted their beer, and he came home with an obsession, a centuries-old technique called fire brewing. Most American breweries heated their kettles with steam, indirect, controlled, predictable. Fire brewing was different. A direct flame roared beneath the copper kettles, pushing temperatures higher than steam ever could. The intense heat caramelized the malt sugars in the wort, producing a deeper, richer flavor that steam-brewed beer could never match. It was expensive, it was difficult, and in Europe, it was already disappearing, a relic of the old world being replaced by modern efficiency. Julius Stroh did not care about efficiency. He cared about the beer. He installed fire brewing equipment at the Gratiot Avenue plant. Massive copper kettles, gas flames shooting 10 to 15 feet beneath them. The brewhouse roared like a furnace. Visitors would later describe the sound as something between a jet engine and a dragon's breath, the kind of noise that shakes your chest before it reaches your ears. Stroh's became the only fire-brewed beer in America. The lion from Kierberg Castle now had its flame, and that flame would define the brand for the next 90 years, printed on every label, repeated in every advertisement, remembered by every worker who ever stood in that brew house and felt the heat on his face. But Julius Stroh could not have known what was coming. In Washington, a movement that had been gathering force since the 1820s was about to reach its climax. The Temperance Crusade had found its moment. Congress was preparing to do what no foreign army, no economic crisis, and no competitor had ever managed to do. They were about to make beer illegal. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect. The manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors became a federal crime. Across America, brewery doors slammed shut. Vats were drained. Workers were sent home. An entire industry, one of the oldest in the nation, was told to disappear. Most breweries did exactly that. They closed, liquidated their equipment, sold their buildings for pennies, and vanished from history. In Detroit alone, breweries that had operated for decades simply ceased to exist. But Julius Stroh had no intention of disappearing. He changed the company's name to the Stroh Products Company, scrubbing the word brewery from the letterhead as if it had never been there. Then he did something remarkably clever. He kept the machinery running, he kept the workers employed, and he found ways to sell everything a brewery could make, except beer. Near beer came first. It was real beer with the alcohol extracted, legal, tasteless, and almost universally despised. But it kept the brewing equipment operational and the supply chains alive. Then came birch beer, ginger ale, club soda, cola, and orange soda. Stroh's produced malt syrups officially marketed for baking, though everyone understood that most of those syrups ended up in basements where Americans brewed their own illegal beer behind locked doors. Julius Stroh sold the ingredients. What customers did with them was their business, but the product that truly saved the company had nothing to do with beer at all. Stroh's ice cream, originally marketed under the Alaska brand, emerged from the same refrigeration equipment that once kept lager cold. The brewery's obsessive quality standards produced a frozen dessert so good that it would outlast the beer itself. Stroh's ice cream is still sold today, more than a century later. It is the only product from Prohibition that never stopped. For 13 years, Julius Stroh held the line. Other Detroit breweries, Goebel, Pfeiffer, E&B, shut down completely during Prohibition, gambling that they could restart when the law changed. Julius refused to take that gamble. He understood something fundamental. A brewery that goes dark may never light up again. Equipment rusts. Workers scatter. Customers forget. On December 5th, 1933, Prohibition ended. The Stroh Brewery Company was back in business immediately because it had never truly stopped. While competitors scrambled to rehire workers, rebuild supply chains, and beg distributors to take them back, Stroh's was already pouring. The 13-year drought had not broken them. It had made them stronger. Julius Stroh did not live to see how far that strength would carry. He died in 1939, passing the presidency to his son Gary. Gary's tenure was steady and unremarkable, the kind of leadership that keeps the lights on without setting the world on fire. In 1950, Gary's brother John took the chair, and that same year, a young man fresh from Princeton University walked through the doors of the Gratiot Avenue Brewery for the first time. His name was Peter Stroh. He was Gary's son. He was 24 years old, and he would one day hold the future of 5 generations in his hands, then let it slip through his fingers. But that reckoning was decades away. In the 1950s, the Stroh Brewery Company was doing what it had always done, brewing good beer for the people of Michigan. By 1956, the Gratiot Avenue plant was pumping out 2.7 million barrels a year, 83.7 million gallons. It was the largest brewery in the state. Life was good. The assembly lines hummed. The fire brewing kettles roared. Detroit was the arsenal of democracy, the Motor City, and Stroh's was its beer. Then the workers walked out. In 1958, a statewide beer strike shut down every major brewery in Michigan. The dispute was simple. Workers wanted higher wages and better conditions. The shutdown hit 5 Detroit breweries simultaneously: Stroh, Goebel, Pfeiffer, Altus, and Schmidt. For nearly 2 months, not a single barrel of Michigan beer rolled off a production line. 2 months does not sound like a long time. It was long enough to change everything. With local breweries silent, out-of-state brands flooded Michigan. Budweiser, Miller, Pabst. National brands with national distribution and national advertising budgets. They filled the shelves, filled the coolers, and filled the glasses of every Michigan beer drinker who still wanted a cold one after work. And when the strike ended, when the local breweries fired up their kettles again, Those national brands did not leave. They had tasted Michigan's market, and they intended to stay. The damage was catastrophic. Goebel, Stroh's rival across the street on Gratiot Avenue, never recovered. Its output cratered from 1.3 million barrels a year to just 215,000. By 1964, Goebel was finished. Stroh's bought its carcass, the company's first acquisition, swallowing the competitor right next door. Pfeiffer fared no better. It abandoned Detroit entirely in 1966, moved brewing to Indiana, and eventually sold its name to Heilemann, a company that would later become part of Stroh's own funeral procession. As for Stroh's itself, the numbers told a brutal story. In 1956, the brewery had sold 2.7 million barrels. A decade later, with Peter Stroh now at the controls, sales had still not recovered to their pre-strike levels. The market Peter inherited in 1968 was smaller, meaner, and dominated by two names that had not existed in Michigan before the strike opened the door: Anheuser-Busch and Miller. Peter Stroh stood at a crossroads. He could accept his company's fate as a regional brewer, respected, profitable, and small. Or he could fight for a seat at the national table. He chose to fight, and that choice would cost his family everything. The summer of 1967 broke Detroit in half. On the morning of July 23rd, police raided an unlicensed after-hours bar on 12th Street. What followed was 5 days of violence that left 43 people dead, nearly 1,500 injured, and more than 2,000 buildings burned to the ground. The National Guard rolled tanks through residential neighborhoods. Snipers fired from rooftops. Entire blocks turned to ash. Peter Stroh climbed to the roof of the Gratiot Avenue Brewery and watched his city burn. He was 40 years old, Princeton educated, but the brewery had not been his first choice. After graduating in 1951 with a degree in international affairs, Peter Stroh had been recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency. He spent a year in Washington waiting for his final security clearance. 3 days after it was approved, a runaway truck crushed him against a building at a Washington intersection. He spent a year in a hospital. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. The CIA was no longer possible. The brewery became his fate. He had joined the company after his recovery, worked his way through every department, and spent years absorbing the rhythms of a business that had not fundamentally changed since his great-grandfather pushed a wheelbarrow down Catherine Street. The Strohs made beer. They stayed in Michigan. They kept their heads down and their kettles hot. That was the way it had always been. But standing on that rooftop, watching smoke rise from neighborhoods just blocks away, something shifted in Peter Stroh. Years later, he would write in a family newsletter that the riots forced him to examine the company's role in the community and his family's role in the city. The answer disturbed him. There had not been one. The Strohs had made their fortune in Detroit for over a century, yet they had barely engaged with the world beyond the brewery walls. Peter threw himself into civic life. He joined the Urban League. He became active in the Detroit branch of the NAACP. He built a close personal friendship with Mayor Coleman Young. Former Mayor Dennis Archer would later say of him, "He never gave up on the city." But Peter Stroh's transformation was not only civic, it was strategic. The 1967 riots accelerated white flight to the suburbs. Detroit's population and its beer-drinking population was shrinking. The 1958 strike had already proven that national brands could invade Michigan at will. And now, the two giants of the industry, Anheuser-Busch and Miller, were locked in a war for national dominance that was crushing every regional brewery caught in the crossfire. Miller had launched Miller Lite in 1975, inventing the light beer category overnight and rocketing from 7th place toward the top. Anheuser-Busch responded with massive advertising spending and ruthless distribution tactics, Between them, the two companies were swallowing the American beer market whole. Their budgets were enormous. Their reach was everywhere. And their message was simple. If you were not national, you were nothing. Peter Stroh looked at the numbers and made his decision. The Stroh Brewery Company could not survive as a regional brewer. It had to go national or it would die. He started by breaking every rule his family had followed for 118 years. First, he ended a 4-decade relationship with the company's local advertising agency and hired a large national firm. The old guard at Stroh's was horrified. This was a family company. Loyalty was sacred. Peter did not care about sacred. He cared about survival. Then he went further. He shattered the company's tradition of family-only management by recruiting executives from Procter & Gamble, PepsiCo, and other consumer goods corporations. Outsiders, men who had never touched a brewing kettle, were now sitting in offices at Gratiot Avenue, making decisions about a beer their families had never tasted. For a company where every share of stock was held by Stroh family members, this was revolution. Peter launched Stroh Light to compete in the exploding light beer market. He approved a new advertising slogan, "The One Beer," designed to position Stroh's as a serious national contender. Led by creative director Murray Page, the campaigns were slick, professional, and nothing like the homespun regional ads Stroh's had run for decades. The results were immediate and astonishing. In 1971, the Stroh Brewery Company climbed from 15th place to 13th in the national rankings. In 1972, it cracked the top 10 for the first time in its history. By 1973, Stroh's was the 8th largest brewery in America, selling 4 million barrels a year across 17 states. In 5 years, Peter Stroh had done what 3 generations before him never attempted. He had put Stroh's on the national map. By 1978, the brewery was producing 6.4 million barrels annually. 400 distributors carried Stroh's products across 28 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean. The lion from Kierberg Castle was no longer a regional mascot. It was roaring across America. But the Gratiot Avenue plant, the beating heart of the company, was suffocating. It was 128 years old, 1 million square feet of brick, copper, and history crammed onto a landlocked site with no room to expand. Shipping beer from Detroit to new markets on the East Coast was brutally expensive. The math was clear. If Peter Stroh wanted to keep growing, he needed more breweries, better breweries, bigger breweries. He could have built them. That would have been the cautious path, the Stroh path. Slow, deliberate, careful. The way Bernhard had done it with a wheelbarrow, the way Julius had done it through Prohibition. Brick by brick. Peter Stroh did not want bricks. He wanted an empire. And in 1981, he found his chance. A wounded company called Schaefer, bleeding out on the floor of the beer wars. Behind Schaefer, an even bigger prize was waiting. The biggest gamble in the history of American brewing was about to begin. The F&M Schaefer Brewing Company was dying in the way that regional breweries died in the 1980s. Slowly, then all at once. Founded in New York in 1842, Schaefer had been a fixture of the Northeast for nearly 140 years. But Miller's low-calorie beer wars had gutted its market share, and by 1980, the company was hemorrhaging money with no path to recovery. Peter Stroh did not see a dying company. He saw exactly what he needed: a modern brewery in Allentown, Pennsylvania, with a capacity of 1 million gallons and a reputation as one of the most efficient operations in the industry. He saw 400 distributors spread across the northeastern United States. He saw 3 established brands, Schaefer, Peels, and Schaefer's Cream Ale, that still carried weight in markets Stroh's had never touched. and he saw all of it available at a price a smarter buyer would have questioned. Stroh paid an initial $800,000 for 8.5% of Schaefer's stock, then moved to acquire the rest. By 1981, the takeover was complete. The combined company ranked 7th in national beer sales. Stroh now had volume exceeding 40 million barrels, distributors in 28 states, plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, and a foothold in the East Coast market that Detroit alone could never have provided. It was a clean deal, a smart deal, the kind of acquisition that business schools teach as a model of strategic expansion. Peter Stroh should have stopped there. He did not stop. He could not stop, because sitting right in front of him, weakened, bleeding, practically begging to be taken, was the Joes. Schlitz Brewing Company. And Schlitz was not a regional player limping toward retirement. Schlitz was a titan. The beer that made Milwaukee famous. The company that had traded the title of America's largest brewer with Anheuser-Busch multiple times throughout the 1950s. At its peak, Schlitz had been the king of American beer. By 1982, the king was on its knees. A series of catastrophic management decisions in the 1970s, cost-cutting measures that visibly degraded the beer's quality, had sent Schlitz into a death spiral. Customers fled. Market share collapsed. The company that once sold more beer than anyone in America had fallen to 4th place and was still falling. Schlitz was desperate, and desperate companies attract predators. 3 buyers circled. Pabst made an offer. G. Heilemann Brewing, an experienced acquirer of struggling regionals, bid aggressively. But the Justice Department's antitrust division blocked Heilemann's attempt, ruling that the combination would concentrate too much of the market in too few hands. The door swung open for Stroh. Early in 1982, Peter Stroh made a bid on 67% of Schlitz stock at $16 a share. Schlitz resisted. The company fought the takeover in court, clinging to independence with the desperation of a boxer who knows the next punch will end the fight. Stroh raised the offer to $17. The Justice Department approved the deal on the condition that Stroh sell either Schlitz's Memphis or Winston-Salem Brewery. On April 15, 1982, Schlitz surrendered. The minnow had swallowed the whale. The numbers were staggering. In 1981, Stroh had brewed 9.2 million barrels of beer. Schlitz had brewed 14.3 million. Peter Stroh had just absorbed a company more than 50% larger than his own. Stroh's now owned 7 brewing plants spread across the country. It controlled roughly 12% of the American beer market. It was the 3rd largest brewing enterprise in the United States, behind only Anheuser-Busch and Miller. Family members would later tell reporters that the Schlitz acquisition felt like a minnow swallowing a whale. Stroh had 1 plant. Schlitz had 6. The sheer volume of integrating that many facilities, that many brands, that many employees overwhelmed a company that had spent 132 years brewing 1 brand of beer in 1 city. And then there was the debt. To finance the Schlitz acquisition, Stroh had borrowed $500 million. $500 million. For a family-owned company with no public stock to sell, no Wall Street investors to dilute the risk, and no margin for error, $500 million was not a number. It was a guillotine blade suspended by a thread. Every month, the interest payments came due. Every month, the company had to sell enough beer to service that debt before it could spend a dime on marketing, equipment, or growth. The timing could not have been worse. The American beer market, which had grown steadily for decades, hit a plateau in the mid-1980s. Total consumption flattened. Competition intensified. Anheuser-Busch and Miller, with their massive advertising budgets, their nationwide distribution networks, and their ruthless pricing strategies, squeezed the margins of every brewer beneath them. The battlefield was no longer about making good beer. It was about spending more money than your competitor, and Stroh was $500 million in the hole before the fight even started. In 1988, Forbes magazine compiled its list of America's greatest family fortunes. The Stroh family appeared on the Forbes 400, their combined wealth estimated at $700 million, calculated largely from the value of the brewery. The empire that Bernhard Stroh had started with a wheelbarrow and $150 was now worth the equivalent of nearly $2 billion in today's money. On paper, it was the peak, the summit, the highest point the lion from Kyerberg Castle would ever reach. But paper lies. Beneath the $700 million valuation, beneath the 7 breweries and the 12% market share and the Forbes 400 listing, the $500 million debt was grinding the company to dust. Market share was not growing. Cash flow was not increasing. And every brand Stroh tried to push into the national spotlight, every dollar spent trying to compete head-to-head with Budweiser and Miller, disappeared into a war it could not win. They did not sell. They held on. And what came next would make the debt look like a rounding error. Peter Stroh tried to make the premium strategy work. He spent heavily, tens of millions, attempting to transform Stroh's from a respected regional brand into a premium national name that could stand shoulder to shoulder with Budweiser and Miller High Life. New advertising campaigns rolled out. New packaging appeared on shelves. New slogans were tested, refined, and discarded. The company introduced Stroh Signature, a super premium beer developed after 2 years of research and 100 recipe tests, designed to capture the high end of the market. None of it worked. The problem was not the beer. The problem was money. Anheuser-Busch and Miller could outspend Stroh on advertising on a factor of 10 and never feel it. Every dollar Peter Stroh poured into national marketing was a dollar borrowed against a debt that was already strangling the company. He was fighting a heavyweight champion with one hand tied behind his back and a 100-pound weight chained to the other. By the time the premium push collapsed, Stroh had lost more than $100 million. And the deeper the losses cut, the harder it became to justify keeping the old Detroit brewery alive. The Gratiot Avenue plant was a monument. 1 million square feet of brewing history, buildings dating from the 1860s to 1914, sprawled across a massive footprint near I-75 on Detroit's east side. It had been the largest brewery in Michigan since the 1890s. In 1956, it had pumped out 2.7 million barrels. At full capacity, it could produce 31 million barrels a year. But capacity meant nothing when the company was only selling 24 million barrels, and that number was falling. The plant was 135 years old. It was landlocked, with no room to expand. It was inefficient compared to the modern facilities Stroh had acquired from Schlitz and Schaefer. Shipping from Detroit to East Coast and southern markets cost more than shipping from Allentown or Winston-Salem. The arithmetic was merciless. The oldest brewery was the most expensive to run, and the debt demanded that every expense be cut to the bone. On February 8, 1985, Peter Stroh stood before reporters and city officials in a conference room at River Place and delivered the news that everyone feared but no one wanted to believe. The Stroh Brewery Company was closing its Detroit plant. The facility was too old, too costly, and too inefficient to save. No combination of civic concessions, labor agreements, or capital investment could change the math. 1,159 people would lose their jobs. $40 million in annual payroll would vanish from the city. Detroit, already reeling from the collapse of its automotive industry, already bleeding population to the suburbs, already carrying scars from the 1967 riots, was about to lose one of the last industrial anchors that had stood by it through everything. The plant did not close overnight. It wound down through the spring, one production line at a time, like a body shutting down organ by organ. The last day came on May 31st, 1985. Stephen Lees had worked at the brewery as a tour guide during his college years and stayed connected to the plant long after. He was there on that final day. So were dozens of other workers, many of them carrying cameras. They walked through the brew house one last time. They photographed the copper kettles where fire-brewing flames had once roared 15 feet into the air. They photographed the bottling lines, the loading docks, the hallways they had walked every day for 10 or 20 or 30 years. Lees wanted to take one of the big red light bulbs from the neon Stroh's beer sign that sat atop the water tower, a glowing beacon that had been visible for miles across Detroit's east side. In our minds, he would later say, we were mourning the death of the brewery, and it seemed a fitting tribute. Judge James Chylinski and Dr. Bernhard Johnson had also worked as tour guides in the 1970s. 3 young men, one who would become a judge, one a dentist, one a CEO, had all worn the white button-down shirts and thin black Stroh's ties while leading visitors through the plant. Decades later, they all said the same thing. That was the best job we ever had. They remembered the fire-brewing equipment like flamethrowers, the roar, the heat, the spectacle of thousands of gallons of wort boiling under direct flame. And they remembered something else. Despite the racial tensions that had torn Detroit apart, the Stroh Brewery employed a diverse workforce, black and white, working side by side, in harmony. It was not a statement. It was just how the brewery operated. Now it was over. 135 years of continuous brewing on Gratiot Avenue. 5 generations of the Stroh family. 1 million square feet of brick, copper, and memory. All of it reduced to a scheduling problem. When to bring in the demolition crews. The answer came the following year. On April 13th, 1986, the first phase of the implosion brought down a section of the complex. On July 13th, the second blast finished the job. The buildings that Bernhard Stroh had expanded in 1865, that Julius Stroh had equipped with fire-brewing kettles in 1908, that had survived Prohibition and 2 world wars and riots and strikes, folded inward and disappeared in a cloud of gray dust. The land was eventually redeveloped as Brewery Park. Crane Communications built its headquarters on the site. Today, there is nothing on Gratiot Avenue that tells you 1,159 people once worked here, that copper kettles once glowed orange with flame, that a man once sold beer from a wheelbarrow on this ground. The fire that Julius Stroh brought from Europe was out. The only fire left was the one burning through the company's balance sheet. A dying company does not fall silent. It thrashes. It grabs at anything within reach. New products, new markets, new strategies, with the frantic energy of a man who has just realized the water is over his head. The Stroh Brewery Company spent the next 14 years thrashing. With the Detroit plant gone and the premium strategy in ruins, Peter Stroh pivoted to diversification. If beer could not generate enough cash to service the debt, then perhaps something else could. White Mountain Cooler, a fruit-flavored drink with 5% alcohol, was launched to chase the wine cooler craze sweeping America in the mid-1980s. Sundance, a sparkling water fruit drink, followed shortly after. Both products landed on shelves, sat there for a while, and quietly disappeared. The cooler fad burned hot and died fast, and Stroh arrived too late to claim any meaningful share of a market that was already collapsing by the time the bottles were printed. Then came real estate. In 1979, the Stroh family had purchased the riverfront Park Davis Pharmaceutical Complex in Detroit and restored it as Stroh River Place, an ambitious mixed-use development that was supposed to signal the family's commitment to the city and generate revenue outside of beer. Peter Stroh poured resources into the project. Detroit's real estate market did not cooperate. The city was still losing population, still losing jobs, still losing the tax base that might have made a riverfront development viable. River Place survived. It did not save anything. Peter Stroh also placed a bet on biotechnology. The details were never fully public, but the investment followed a pattern that was becoming painfully familiar. Money spent chasing opportunity in a field far removed from the family's expertise, generating losses instead of lifelines. The core beer business was bleeding. And instead of stopping the bleeding, Peter Stroh was opening new wounds. Meanwhile, the international market offered a glimmer of genuine hope. In 1986, the company created Stroh International to target overseas markets: Canada, India, Japan, Mexico, and Russia. The results were impressive on paper. From 1992 through 1995, Stroh's international sales grew at rates exceeding 50% each year. In 1994, a licensing agreement with Rajasthan breweries outside Delhi made Stroh's one of the first American beers brewed and sold in India. The following year, Sapporo breweries began distributing Stroh's nationwide in Japan. By 1995, exports accounted for more than 10% of overall sales. But 10% of a shrinking number is still a shrinking number. International growth could not outrun domestic collapse. At home, the market share that had stood at 12% in 1985 was being cut nearly in half. Stroh's was falling from third place to fourth. The company that had swallowed Schlitz was now being swallowed by the market itself. In 1989, Peter Stroh made one final attempt to escape. He negotiated a deal to sell the entire company to Coors. It was the exit, the last clean chance to preserve something for the family, to pay down the debt, to walk away before the ship went under completely. The deal fell through. The reasons were never fully disclosed, but the result was devastating. Stroh had signaled to the industry, to its distributors, and to its own employees that it wanted out. And then it was forced to stay. Peter Stroh stepped down as CEO in early 1995. He was 68 years old. He had led the company for 27 years, longer than any Stroh before him. He had taken a regional brewer and made it the third largest in America. And he had taken a $700 million family fortune and set it on a path towards zero. Friends said the decline of the company was very painful to him. He rarely spoke to the press about it. The weight of 5 generations is not the kind of burden a man discusses with strangers. His replacement was William Henry, the first person outside the Stroh family to run the company in 145 years. The symbolism was impossible to miss. When a family that has held every share of stock since 1850 hands the keys to an outsider, it is not a strategic decision. It is a surrender. Henry inherited a company that was fourth in the nation, but hemorrhaging cash in a flat market. His solution was the same solution Peter Stroh had reached for in 1982: acquisition. If you cannot grow organically, you buy growth. And in 1996, William Henry found his target. The G. Heilemann Brewing Company of La Crosse, Wisconsin, was a corpse that had been resuscitated twice and was dying a third time. Founded in 1858, Heilemann had grown through aggressive acquisitions into the fourth largest brewer in America by 1983, with over $1 billion in sales. Then an Australian investor named Alan Bond executed a hostile takeover in 1987 for $1.3 billion, a deal financed almost entirely with debt. When the stock market crashed a month later, Bond's financial empire crumbled, and Heilemann was dragged into bankruptcy in 1991. A Dallas investment firm bought Heilemann out of bankruptcy in 1993 for $390 million. The new owners had no brewing experience. They made several missteps. By early 1996, Heilemann declared bankruptcy a second time, unable to make interest payments or meet payroll. Stroh stepped in and bought the wreckage for approximately $290 million. On paper, the deal looked rational. Heilemann brought more than 30 brands to the Stroh portfolio: Old Style, Rainier, Henry Weinhard, Lone Star, Schmitz, Champale, National Bohemian, and Colt 45 malt liquor. Combined with Schlitz malt liquor, Stroh now controlled more than half the malt liquor market. The purchase added 5 breweries in La Crosse, Portland, Seattle, San Antonio, and Baltimore. The combined company held roughly 10% of the American beer market. But look closer. Stroh had just bought a company that had bankrupted 2 previous owners. It had assumed $87 million in employee retirement and pension obligations. It had taken on $50 million in trade debt. And it had added all of this to the mountain of debt it was already carrying from the Schlitz acquisition 14 years earlier. Total debt now approached $700 million. $700 million, the same number Forbes had once used to describe the Stroh family's entire net worth. The family fortune and the family debt were now the same figure. One was real. The other was a memory. 3 months after completing the Heilemann deal, Stroh announced it was closing the Baltimore Brewery. Workers who had survived 6 ownership changes already took it in stride. One 54-year-old employee, sipping a National Bohemian at a bar half a mile from the plant, told a reporter the only thing he had learned from 30 years in the business: "We have learned to take it in stride." The grave was waiting. Stroh was still running, but the distance between them was closing fast. The last years of the Stroh Brewery Company were not a battle. They were an autopsy performed on a body that had not yet stopped breathing. After the Heilemann acquisition, Stroh held more than 30 brands across 7 breweries. On a spreadsheet, it looked like an empire. In reality, it was a warehouse full of tombstones: Old Style, Rainier, Lone Star, Schaefer, Peels, Schlitz, National Bohemian, Colt 45. Every one of them a name that had once meant something: a city, a tradition, a loyalty. And every one of them damaged, declining, or dying before Stroh ever touched it. Stroh had not acquired strength. It had acquired the collected wreckage of a half-century of industry consolidation, and it was paying $700 million in debt for the privilege of owning it. William Henry tried one final gamble. He attempted to rejuvenate the core Stroh's brand, the original fire-brewed beer, the name that had carried the family from a wheelbarrow on Catherine Street to the Forbes 400. New marketing, new positioning, a push to remind American beer drinkers that Stroh's was still here, still real, still worth choosing over the endless parade of Budweiser and Miller commercials that dominated every television set in the country. The campaign backfired. Industry analysts would later describe it as the steepest decline in American brewing history. Instead of stabilizing, Stroh's market share accelerated downward. The brand that Peter Stroh had spent $100 million trying to make premium was now in free fall. Whatever loyalty remained among Stroh's drinkers, the blue-collar Midwesterners, the Michigan factory workers, the college kids who had grown up watching Alex the dog fetch beers in television commercials, was not enough to stop the bleeding. Revenue fell, but the debt payments did not. $700 million does not care about your marketing strategy. It does not care about your heritage. It does not care that your great-great-grandfather won a blue ribbon at the Columbian Exposition. It comes due on the 1st of every month, and if you cannot pay, it eats you alive. By 1998, there was genuine concern inside the company that Stroh would not be able to make its next interest payment. The cash flow was not there. The market share was not there. The options were bankruptcy, a public humiliation that would erase 149 years of family pride, or a controlled sale that might preserve something, anything, from the wreckage. In 1999, the first piece was cut away. Stroh Canada was sold to Sleeman Breweries in Guelph, Ontario, a division of Japan's Sapporo Breweries. Sleeman gained Canadian rights to manufacture and distribute Stroh's, Old Milwaukee, and Pabst. It was a bid for cash, a tourniquet applied to a wound that had long since gone arterial. It was not enough. On February 8, 1999, 14 years to the day after Peter Stroh had announced the closing of the Detroit Brewery, John Stroh III stood before the press. He was Peter's cousin, the fifth generation, the last Stroh who would ever run the company his great-great-grandfather had founded. He was the president and chief executive officer of a brewery that had been family-owned for 149 years, and he was about to end it. The Stroh Brewery Company was selling its brands to the Pabst Brewing Company and the Miller Brewing Company. John Stroh III called it an emotionally extremely difficult decision. He acknowledged that it would impact loyal employees. He recognized that 149 years of family tradition were ending. He said the things a man says when there is nothing left to say, the measured, careful words of someone who has rehearsed the worst sentence of his life and is now delivering it to a room full of people who already know what is coming. The sale price was approximately $350 million. Most of it went to debt service. A significant portion went to employee pension fund liabilities, the retirement promises made to workers at 7 breweries across the country. Workers who had brewed Stroh's and Schlitz and Old Milwaukee and Colt 45 and believed that the company paying into their pension fund would still exist when they needed it. What remained went into a family trust that distributed checks to Stroh family members. Those checks arrived regularly for 9 years. In 2008, the fund was exhausted. Every dollar was gone. Stroh was the 4th largest brewer in America at the moment of its death. It was no longer profitable, no longer growing, no longer capable of surviving in a market where 2 companies controlled nearly half of all beer sold. But the industry did not mourn the loss of a competitor. It mourned the loss of an idea. The idea that a family could build something with their hands, hold it across generations, and pass it forward forever. Stroh's death was the last gasp of the great regional breweries, the final proof that in the American beer industry, there was no room left for anyone who was not a giant. Bernhard Stroh had built a brewery with $150. 5 generations later, $700 million could not save it. The lion from Kierberg Castle was now the property of Pabst Brewing Company. The fire-brewed kettles were cold, and the Stroh family, once among the richest in America, was about to learn that losing a company is not the worst thing that can happen to a dynasty. Losing each other is. The company was gone. The debt was paid. Or rather, the debt had consumed the payment. The brands belonged to Pabst and Miller. The breweries belonged to whoever bought them at auction. The 7 plants that Peter Stroh had assembled across a decade of desperate acquisitions were scattered to new owners who would brew other people's beer in buildings that once carried the Stroh name. All that remained was the family, and the family was already breaking apart. The trust fund, established from the sale, distributed checks to Stroh family members, the shareholders who had held every share of stock since Bernhard Stroh signed his first deed in 1850. For 149 years, the family's wealth had been the brewery. The brewery was the family. They were the same thing. Now the brewery was gone, and all that was left was a finite pool of money being divided among people who had never agreed on much of anything except that the money would always be there. The checks came, and then they stopped. In 2008, 9 years after the sale, the fund was exhausted. The family that Forbes had valued at $700 million in 1988 had nothing. If they had simply invested that $700 million in an index fund tracking the S&P 500, the Stroh family would be worth approximately $9 billion today. Instead, they had gambled it on an acquisition strategy that failed, a diversification plan that failed, and a brand revival that produced the steepest decline in American brewing history. $9 billion of potential wealth, erased by decisions made in boardrooms by men who believed they could outrun the math. But the money was only the visible wound. Beneath it lay something worse. Francis Stroh grew up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, one of the wealthiest suburbs in America, a manicured enclave of old money separated from Detroit by a border that might as well have been a wall. Her earliest memories were of enormous privilege. Shopping trips to London and New York, lunches served by waiters in black ties at the Regency Hotel, a house filled with precious antiques she was forbidden to touch. The Stroh children lived inside a beautiful frame, polished, posed, and empty. Her father was Eric Stroh, Peter's brother. Eric had worked at the brewery but left after a conflict with the CEO. He was a man of compulsive passions. He collected antiques, guns, guitars, cameras. 80 Leica cameras were found among his possessions when he died. 80, along with dozens of boxes of photographs that had never been organized, never been curated, never been shared. He was an artist trapped inside the expectations of a brewing dynasty, a man who poured his creative energy into acquiring objects instead of making meaning from them. He drank. The drinking got worse. The marriage did not survive. Francis's brother Charlie followed a darker path. Drug addiction pulled him under, the kind of slow drowning that a family with money can hide for years but never cure. He was arrested. The arrest became one more crack in a facade that the Strohs had spent generations maintaining. In Grosse Pointe, appearances were everything. The Stroh name meant something. It meant wealth, respectability, permanence. It meant you did not air your problems in public. You did not admit weakness. You smiled for the photograph and kept the rest behind closed doors. Francis would later write that the family communicated through scripted conversations, polite, measured exchanges that maintained the surface without ever touching what lay beneath. Unconditional love, she observed, much like money, sometimes comes in limited supply. The Strohs had built an empire on craftsmanship, on the meticulous attention to fire and copper and grain that produced a beer worth crossing the street for. But they had not built a family capable of surviving the loss of that empire. When the money disappeared, there was nothing underneath to hold them together. No shared purpose, no honest reckoning, no language for the grief that comes when 5 generations of work vanish in a single press conference. In 2016, Francis Stroh published a memoir called Beer Money. The subtitle was a memoir of privilege and loss. In it, she laid bare the parallel collapses, the company and the family, the fortune and the bonds between the people who once shared it. She wrote about her father's alcoholism and her brother's addiction. She wrote about the divorce and the disputes over money. She wrote about the photographs, the endless, carefully composed family portraits that showed smiling faces and hid everything else. We allowed ourselves to be pinned into place, she wrote. And in our search for freedom, some of us self-destructed. The book was not a settling of scores. It was not an exposé. Critics and readers recognized something rarer, an honest accounting from inside a world that rarely permits honesty. The New York Times called it absorbing. The Washington Post noted that it carried a particular sting because Francis argued that privilege itself came with substantial costs. Kirkus Reviews called it a sorrowful, eye-opening examination of familial dysfunction. Francis Stroh had done something no other member of her family could do. She had looked at the ruins, the brewery, the fortune, the relationships, and instead of turning away, she turned them into art. Her father had collected 80 cameras and never organized a single photograph. His daughter organized everything, every memory, every wound, every lie the family had told itself, and put it on the page. It was, In its own way, an act of fire brewing. Take the raw material, apply direct heat. Do not look away when it burns. There is a place on Detroit's east side, just off Gratiot Avenue, near the I-75 interchange, where the ground holds no memory. It is called Brewery Park. Office buildings stand here now. Crane Communications, the media company that publishes Crane's Detroit business, built its headquarters on this soil. There are parking lots and landscaped walkways and the kind of clean, modern architecture that announces corporate efficiency without whispering a single word about what came before. If you drove past it today at 60 miles an hour on the interstate, you would never slow down. There is nothing to slow down for. No historical marker, no bronze plaque, no preserved wall or display case holding a fragment of copper pipe. Nothing that tells you that beneath this ground, 1,159 people once earned their living. Nothing that tells you a man once pushed a wheelbarrow full of beer down these streets. Nothing that tells you the largest fire-brewed brewery in America once stood here. 1 million square feet of brick, steel, and copper stretching across a footprint that took 135 years to build and 7 seconds to erase. The buildings went down on April 13th and July 13th, 1986. 2 controlled implosions, 3 months apart, performed with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a dead organ. The crowd that gathered to watch the first blast stood at a safe distance, far enough to avoid the debris, close enough to feel the concussion in their chests. When the dust cleared, the skyline looked wrong. The brewery had been part of Detroit's east side for so long that its absence felt like a missing tooth. The eye kept going to the gap, expecting to find something solid, finding only air. The water tower was gone. The neon sign that had glowed red against the Detroit sky, Stroh's beer, visible for miles, a lighthouse for a city that navigated by factory smoke and brewery steam, was gone. The brew house where Julius Stroh had installed his fire brewing kettles in 1908 was gone. Those kettles, the massive copper vessels where direct flame roared 15 feet beneath thousands of gallons of boiling wort, caramelizing the malt sugars, filling the building with heat so intense that workers described it as standing inside a living furnace, were gone. The bottling lines where millions of bottles had been filled, capped, and crated for shipment to 28 states were gone. The loading docks where teamsters from Local 20 in Toledo had backed their rigs up to the platform, day after day, year after year, hauling Stroh's beer across the Midwest on trucks leased from Ruin Leasing, gone. The stables where horses had once pulled delivery wagons through Detroit's unpaved streets in the 1870s, gone so long that no one alive remembered them. 1 million square feet, reduced to rubble, reduced to fill, reduced to a flat, blank canvas on which someone else would write a different story. But not everyone forgot. Stephen Lees never forgot. He had worn the white button-down shirt and the thin black Stroh's tie as a college-age tour guide, leading visitors through the plant, explaining the fire brewing process, watching their faces when they felt the heat from the kettles for the first time. He had been there on the last day, May 31st, 1985, carrying a camera, wanting to take one of the big red light bulbs from the sign. He had said it himself. In our minds, we were mourning the death of the brewery. Decades later, when Pabst Brewing announced that Stroh's Bohemian-style Pilsner would once again be brewed in Detroit, this time at Brew Detroit in the Corktown neighborhood, Lees did not hesitate. "I do not care who is making it," he said, "just that they are back in Detroit where they belong." Judge James Chylinski never forgot. He had stood in the same brew house as a young man, watched the same flames, poured the same beer for tour groups who came to see how it was made. He had gone on to law school, to the bench, to a career that took him far from Gratiot Avenue. But when someone asked about the best job he ever had, the answer was always the same. The brewery. Always the brewery. Dr. Bernhard Johnson never forgot. He had been one of the few black tour guides at a time when Detroit was tearing itself apart along racial lines. He remembered the brewery as a place where the color of your skin mattered less than the quality of your work. A place where people showed up, did the job, and went home, together. He became a dentist. He built a career. But the brewery stayed with him the way first loves stay, not because they were perfect, but because they were real. 3 men, a judge, a dentist, and a CEO. They had all started in the same place, young, broke, wearing matching ties, walking tourists through a building that smelled like roasted grain and copper and fire. They had all gone on to build lives that had nothing to do with beer. And they all carried the same wound, the same pride, the same stubborn insistence that what happened on Gratiot Avenue mattered, even if the buildings were gone, and the company was dead, and the family had scattered like ash. In 2016, something small and improbable happened. Pabst Brewing Company, the corporation that had purchased the Stroh's brand in 1999, struck a deal with Brew Detroit, a contract brewery operating in the Corktown neighborhood on the city's west side. Together, they would revive the Stroh's Bohemian-style Pilsner, brewed from the original recipe that Bernhard Stroh had brought from Germany in 1849. For the first time in 31 years, Stroh's beer would be made in Detroit. It was not a resurrection. The Stroh family had no hand in it. Peter Stroh had died in 2002 of brain cancer at the age of 74 at his home in Grosse Pointe Farms. Friends said the decline of the company's position in the brewing industry had been very painful to him, a weight he carried quietly to the end. His cousin John had delivered the final press conference and moved on. Frances had written her book and made peace with the ruins in her own way. The Strohs were no longer brewers. They were history. But the beer came back. And Detroit, a city that understood collapse and reinvention better than any city in America, welcomed it with the unsentimental affection of a neighbor who has seen you at your worst and still leaves the porch light on. Frances Stroh called the relaunch a brilliant move by Pabst and said it came at the perfect time in Detroit's trajectory. She was right. Detroit in 2016 was not the Detroit of 1985. The bankruptcy of 2013 had come and gone. New businesses were opening in Midtown and Corktown. Young people were moving into neighborhoods that had been empty for decades. The city was not healed. Cities do not heal the way bodies do. But it was moving. It was building. It was doing what Detroit has always done after disaster. It was starting over. The Stroh's Pilsner that came out of Brew Detroit was not fire brewed. No American brewery uses fire brewing anymore. The technique that Julius Stroh carried home from Europe in 1908, the direct flame beneath the copper kettles, the caramelized malt sugars, the roar that shook your chest, exists now only in memory and in the faded text of old advertisements. The beer on the shelf is brewed with modern equipment, in a modern facility, by people who never set foot in the Gratiot Avenue plant. The lion from Kierberg Castle is still on the label. The recipe is still Bohemian-style Pilsner, but the fire is gone. And perhaps that is the truest thing about this story. The fire was always the point. Bernhard Stroh carried it from Germany. The knowledge, the craft, the stubborn immigrant belief that if you made something good enough, people would find you. Julius Stroh refined it, literally, with flame and copper, turning heat into flavor. Peter Stroh tried to spread it across the country, across the industry, across a vision of national dominance that required more fuel than the family possessed. And when the fuel ran out, the fire consumed the house it was supposed to heat. 5 generations, 149 years. From a wheelbarrow on Catherine Street to the Forbes 400 to a trust fund that ran dry in 2008. From a basement brewery to the third largest beer company in America to a name on someone else's label. From a family that held every share of stock to a family that held nothing but memories and a memoir called Beer Money. The lion from Kyerberg Castle still stands on the bottle. It has stood there since 1865, when Bernhard Stroh looked across the Atlantic toward the hometown he would never see again and chose a symbol that meant permanence, strength, and pride. 161 years later, the lion belongs to Pabst. The castle still stands in Kiern. And on Gratiot Avenue, where fire once roared beneath copper kettles and 1,159 people once punched the clock every morning, there is only Brewery Park, office buildings, parking lots, clean sidewalks. If you stand there long enough and close your eyes, you might hear it. The low roar of a flame shooting 15 feet beneath a copper kettle, the hiss of wort boiling, the clank of bottles on a conveyor belt, the sound of a wheelbarrow rolling over cobblestones, the sound of something being built, the sound of something worth keeping, but when you open your eyes, it is gone. All of it. Gone like fire, gone like beer money, gone like every empire that believed it would last forever.